Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever is appropriate wherever you are, and welcome to the first question and answer session I'm going to have here at the YouTube channel. I've gotten some questions in by email. I'm dealing with one of them today because it's a fairly substantial question and it deserves its own video. I want to stress the fact in this instance that it's a general question and it's one where I can answer it pretty much for most people from any nation thinking of relocating to any other nation. It doesn't have to be in relationship to Panama at all. It is a common situation globally. Now, let's start right off the bat here. I'm going to make this informal. It isn't scripted. I have given some thought to what I want to say. But I'd like to think that we're sitting together in the living room somewhere and we're friends and I'm just talking to you. So, with that in mind, Beverly got the first one in. And she says, Bob, where is the least expensive cost of living? Well, Beverly, that's a question I hear a great deal about. And I know that you're talking about Panama in particular, but I'm talking about anywhere. It doesn't make any difference where you go. I've lived in so many different nations that I've gotten a general sense for some of the major factors that affect cost of living and happiness. The two cannot be separated. And I want to share those. And they are not directly related to Panama at all. One of the problems that people who are looking elsewhere to relocate, one of the problems they have, if it's a country they think of as a developing nation, in the old days we were called third world or something like that, is that these people are very, very poor and there's nothing there, and so everything is super cheap because they're so poor, so I can get along on pennies a day, etc., and so forth. There was some truth to that. It's not really a lot, but some truth to it. Because in the past, it wasn't that things were so cheap, it's just they weren't there. When I started out in Africa, my second overseas assignment, my first one was in Asia. But I went to Ghana in West Africa. And I went with a humanitarian agency, and I was going to be paid the princely sum of $450 a month. And in those days, even though it was 40-some years ago, it still was not a lot of money, and it was much less than I had been paid. But I wanted to do it because this is where I wanted to dedicate my life. So I did it, and I arrived thinking, oh my God, how am I going to make ends meet? I had no problem. I had no problem because indeed, Ghana was very poor at that stage, and the stores had very little in them that was interesting to me, and if it was at all interesting to me, it wasn't very good quality, it was very poor quality. But on the whole, there was so many things I might have bought, but they were not available. Since there was no one there to buy them, or not enough of us there to buy them, it was not worth bringing them in. So availability is the primary reason why life overseas was so much cheaper in decades past. You just had to go out and find ways to spend money in some instances. Well, that's gone. And especially in the large urban areas, like Panama City and Panama, but it can be anywhere, Bangkok in Thailand, it can be Johannesburg in South Africa, wherever you go. In these large urban areas, availability is not a question any longer. Wealth has grown in the so-called third world that used to be called that. I mean, it's a completely different planet now. And the last couple decades have shown dramatic growth. The result is that you can go anywhere and find pretty much anything. Now, that's not always the case, and there'll be some specific things that you won't find wherever you do go, especially if you've changed cultures completely. Say, going from France to Japan, you might find the selection of cheese is not exactly what you were looking for. I don't know. I haven't made that trip. But the key point is that most things that you want, and a lot of things that you don't know you want, but you might think you do, are going to be available wherever you go. And unless you have self-discipline, you're going to end up having the difficulty most of us do have and avoiding buying this or buying that we see as we walk through a market, for example. It's just the way we are as human beings. The cheaper life of 20, 30, 40 years ago in smaller nations or developing nations was, again, not self-discipline. It was availability, and that is what provided the discipline, not the individual. So today, it's very difficult not to find all sorts of attractive, interesting things to buy in pretty much any major urban center that you go to anywhere. And so if you've got that image of it being just automatically cheaper in most nations overseas, forget it. It's just, don't assume that. It's a dangerous thing to assume. You're going to be disappointed, very often disappointed, if not all the time. Now, a second thing that is very active now, and now we're getting down to the meat of it, so to speak, is that most nations have a single major metropolitan area, especially the smaller nations like Panama City. But it's true of many nations. In Mexico City by far and away is the biggest and most sophisticated center of population in a much, much larger nation than Panama. So it is that some nations have 2 or 3, but you really very few that have a dozen or 5 or 6. China maybe, the U.S. maybe, but most nations don't. So you have that one major metropolitan area. You will find everything under the sun that you want there. You will find all the amenities. Now, you know, I define amenity as something you want. And whatever it is, that's an amenity to you. And if something I want that you don't want, that's not an amenity. So regardless, these urban areas are going to have plenty of amenities that you are going to appreciate. And that will add to your cost of living. So it's very traditional for people who do not have to be in a major urban area, because they're not working there, for example. They may go out into the rural areas. This is particularly true of retired people, but it can, you know, be true of a number of people. And when they get there, they find everything so much cheaper. Well, availability pops back into the picture, because in many rural areas in the nation, as is true in the United States, I might add, and a few others, you can get out in the rural areas and just not find that much to buy in local stores compared to what you had in the city. It's the same thing here. So this helps to reduce cost of living. And the other item, and this is way more significant than how much a pound of coffee costs, is housing. Now, people often will rent when they first arrive in a new nation. Some will buy. But in either case, the major urban center is likely to be the most expensive place to do that. You go out in the rural areas, the further you get away from that major urban agglomeration, the more likely you are to pay much, much less in rent or in purchasing a home. It's commonsensical, it's perfectly logical. But this is tough for a lot of folks, because although they're limited in maybe, or choose to be limited in what they actually spend, and they put that as their number one priority, and I understand that, there are things they want. There are amenities, things they want that they can't get. It's very frustrating for them. They want the best of both worlds, so to speak, and they can't find it in that area. But at least the single biggest expense, housing, is much reduced. Maybe the difference between $1,500 and $500 or whatever. It can be bigger than that between the major urban center and the rural areas. So they've got a plus there that's very hard for many of them to turn down. There is another cost associated with it that you might keep in mind. Now, anybody anywhere may need a car to get around. But if you don't absolutely require one, then you best be living in that major city. Out in the rural areas, you may have a lovely place, but it's almost impossible for you to be able to walk easily to get everything that you're going to need in the way of shopping just for normal life. You're probably going to need a vehicle, you're going to have to use it. Now, that's not the end of the world, but it's definitely an added expense. I live in Panama City. I'm 1 block from a shopping mall and with the restaurants and the movie theater, 4 blocks from another shopping mall and so forth, 4 blocks from a major supermarket, lots of restaurants around me and so on. I don't have a car. I don't want to. The traffic's terrible, but it's also the expense is substantial for such a vehicle, when all of a sudden, if you've ever owned a car, you know what I mean. So not owning one is a big plus. And I want to go somewhere, I can use a taxi, I can use Uber, I can use any of a number of services like that, or I can walk, which I do frequently. And this gives me a certain freedom, oddly enough. I'm not free to just jump in the car and drive anywhere I want to, but I'm free of this constant concern of traffic, finding a place to park, having to pay, going into the mechanics and leaving it there for 3 or 4 days. I've been through that, like most of you. I'm perfectly happy to put that behind me. I can get that in an urban area. So in that sense, I'm actually saving money over somebody who lives out in a rural area where they must have a vehicle in order to live comfortably. That's another factor to take into account too, but still, nonetheless, Panama City or any of the major urban agglomerations around this planet, these are going to be way more expensive than the rural areas, and the further you get away from that urban center, the likelihood it is that it will get cheaper. There will be specific areas in the country where tourists come, lots of hotels and what have you, as we have here in Panama, which will be very expensive because of that. But we're not talking about those when we talk about rural areas. They're pretty well built up. They might as well be called urban. When I say rural, I mean rural. Small towns and villages and countryside. One area to give some thought to that most people don't, because it's not presented to them. So I'm going to present it to you as something to simply think about. And that's what I refer to as second-tier cities. Now, in Panama, for instance, we have a number of them. Names like Santiago and Chitre and Las Tablas and David and so forth. These cities may be an eighth or a tenth the size of Panama City. They don't have all the various services and products that Panama City has. But they have a lot more than the rural areas. And more importantly, they're picking up more and more every year. Now, in countries where the economy is growing, maybe not as dramatically as it has in Panama, but still nonetheless is growing, I think you'll find what we've seen here in the last decade, which is a substantial increase in the number of services and products available in those cities, and especially in the last 2 or 3 years. Once this thing gets started, it tends to roll. You get the big supermarkets come out, the banks set up branches. They already are banks, but you have, instead of having 3, you have 12, this sort of thing. You have more and more activity. Now, these cities often are not beautiful cities. They're just ordinary cities because they're there for an economic reason. Now, that's good, because that means that city's been there for a long time, is likely to be there for a long time, because it has some economic justification for its existence, other than tourists coming down, if it happens to be a good year for tourists. So that's a value, but on the other hand, it's not going to be gorgeous. But given the increase in the amenities available in the second tier, but given that they don't have it all, and they don't have the average income, household income, there is not going to be as high as it is in Panama City. The availability will be wider than it is in the rural areas, less than it is in Panama City, and that will include many of the very expensive things in Panama City that you are probably just as well not seeing anyhow. Keep the temptation away from you. The housing there is going to be substantially cheaper than it is in Panama City, but it's going to be more expensive in all likelihood than you will find out in the rural areas. There are variability here, but common sense tells you that's likely to be the case. It's the same in other countries. This is nothing special to Panama about this at all, but just most people have it in their heads that it's a decision between living in the urban center, or very close to it, or living in the rural areas in order to avoid spending too much money. I'm saying there's a third area. I'm not recommending it, because I don't recommend. You are the one who decides what works for you. And for some of you, it's definitely going to be the city. And for others, definitely going to be the rural areas. But there will be among you those who will say, well, all right, maybe he's right. Maybe this is something we need to look at too. So I'm going to encourage you to keep that in mind when you move in to an area. And even if you come in to rent, and you rent, say, in the city or in the rural area or whatever, where you think you might be interested in living, and you find it just doesn't work for you, get in the car and go off to some of the second-tier cities that are near to you, and take a good look at them and be fair to them. Don't expect them to be gorgeous and dramatic, but good places to live, relatively inexpensive. You'll find there are other expatriates there and so forth, and there's a broader range of different types of people, including the local people, nationals who will certainly be there too, because jobs are being created in these cities, and it pays to stay there instead of moving into the big urban center. That's you might find yourself a very pleasant place to live within your means that is going to give you enough of the good things of the big urban center and enough of the good things of the rural area to make it a very pleasant place to live. As another group of people might be interested in this too, and there are people who write me all the time, and they say, Bob, what are the gaps, the holes in the market in Panama City? What is it they don't have that we have up in the U.S. or we have in the U.K. or wherever that maybe I can start a business here in this and fill this hole and make money? And 10, 11 years ago when I first came, there were definitely gaps. I could see them. Almost all of them are gone. And not just with one or two companies coming in to fill them, but several. I mean, that's changed dramatically. It's much harder to find a gap here. No, you can come down and I can tell you, I've never seen a this or that or whatever. But you go out, if you really look for it, you'll find it. And you may find 2, 3, or 4 of them. This, I'm taken by surprise frequently by how much is now available here in Panama City, and or wherever. It'd be the same where I'm in Manila or wherever I was living. How much more there was available now than there had been. So if you're the rural area, though, a lot of people go out there to set up a bed and breakfast, a little hotel, a restaurant, things, which can be wonderful and can be very successful, but they can also fail because the rural areas tend to have a very small local market of anybody who's interested in spending the money to that business, and may thus be dependent on the visits of people from the city or tourists or whatever, which can be very changeable or very seasonal, and it can be very hard to make ends meet and a heck of a lot of work out there. Second-tier cities are again a possibility here because although their gaps, their holes, so to speak, in what they have to offer are being filled up, they haven't all been filled up. It's just common sense tells you that. You do have to move on it. It will happen, but it's far less likely to have happened there than it would in the major urban center. And it's also an area with a large enough population that you have a good chance of finding the clientele who, once you offer them something that's new and different, it may just be a different style of restaurant. It may be one of 120 restaurants, but the only one like it, or something of this sort that catches on. You've got a large enough community that you may be able to make this work for you and be profitable to boot. So it's also something to be kept in mind for that, because so many of the people who are looking to earn some income here just focus on the major urban center. And, well, folks, there's a lot of people here already, and probably a lot of people with a similar background to you and who are much more familiar with the local language and culture. So competition can be tough. Again, wherever you go, and I don't care if you're going from France to the United States, it works the same way. Give it some thought to this third level, which is in between the rural and the urban and is so typically ignored. And I don't live there, so obviously it isn't meeting my needs, but it might meet yours. And it can reduce your cost of living without leaving you in a position where you end up spending more than you expected, and you have to go way into the urban center to get what you really need. That's a problem too. So you're looking for that kind of balance in terms of housing costs and to the availability of the things you want and the things you need. And the really super expensive stuff, maybe you don't need to see that so often. I don't. I see it every day, but I don't buy it. Give it thought. And if it works for you, come on down or go wherever you're thinking of going. And after you get to what is likely to be the major urban center where the major airport is, when you go out to see the countryside or to see the tourist sites, take a little time. Drop by one of these second-tier cities and look around. And talk to people locally. It's worth your time and effort. Cost of living and happiness are not necessarily the same thing. But one may be critical. Well, both are critical, and you don't want to forget them. So you're looking for the best combination where you can find a place that you can afford, but at the same time, a place that where you can get what you need to live happily. That, I think, is the best answer to you. Now, Beverly, you're going to have to come down here and look in the source at what it is you buy every month, and you need to know that's important to you. It could be drugs from a drugstore or whatever. I don't know, because I can't really respond to the specifics to anybody, because we're all different. We have different needs. But in general, there are some ideas I'd like to share, and those are just a couple of them. I hope you find it somewhat useful. And thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I will be back. If you want to ask further questions on subjects like this, never be shy. I'm welcome. I do my best to answer it as well as I can. And I really do appreciate the fact that you take the time to listen to it.